Today we're talking about a major case that the Supreme Court has officially agreed to review, Case versus Montana. This case could have a significant impact on our constitutional rights, especially when it comes to the Fourth Amendment and the limits on law enforcement entering a person's home without a warrant. The central issue in this case is whether police officers can legally enter a home without a warrant under certain circumstances, and whether such actions violate a person's constitutional protections. What makes this challenge so critical is that it seeks to build on a previous unanimous 9-0 Supreme Court decision, Caniglia versus Strom. In Caniglia versus Strom, the court held that the so-called community caretaking exception to the Fourth Amendment does not extend to the home. In that case, the police had entered Mr. Caniglia's residence without a warrant and seized his firearms after a welfare check, even though there was no immediate threat or emergency that justified such an action. Justice Clarence Thomas, writing for the court, made it clear that warrantless entry into a home under the community caretaking doctrine violated the Constitution. Now, in Case versus Montana, the petitioner is attempting to expand on the precedent set in Caniglia versus Strom. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear arguments on this case in its upcoming term. Here's the background. The case arises from an incident involving Trevor Case and his ex-girlfriend, who called the police and claimed that Trevor had threatened to harm himself and may have had access to a firearm. Law enforcement officers responded and arrived at his home. Despite suspecting that Trevor Case was not posing a threat to others, and without any immediate exigent circumstances, the officers waited nearly 40 minutes before entering the home without a warrant. During the encounter, it's been reported that an officer claimed to see a shadow or believed that Mr. Case might be armed. A confrontation ensued, and Trevor Case was ultimately shot by police. A firearm was later recovered, reportedly hidden in a hamper inside the home. Following the incident, Trevor Case was charged and later convicted of assaulting a law enforcement officer. However, his legal team is now arguing that the entire police entry and search was unconstitutional from the beginning. They claim the warrantless entry violated Trevor's Fourth Amendment rights, and therefore the firearm and other evidence found during the illegal search should be suppressed and excluded from the case entirely. Now, although Mr. Case presented strong constitutional arguments, those claims were rejected by the lower courts. Eventually, his challenge reached the Montana Supreme Court. In a closely divided 4-3 decision, the Montana Supreme Court upheld the denial of his motion to suppress the evidence found during the warrantless entry into his home. The majority in that court ruled that the officers had an objectively reasonable belief that something was seriously wrong, which, in their view, justified entering the home without a warrant under an emergency exception. However, Mr. Case's legal team strongly disagrees with this reasoning. They argue that the Montana Supreme Court misapplied the legal standard. According to Mr. Case, the court's use of the reasonable belief test improperly weakens previous rulings from the U.S. Supreme Court. Those rulings made it clear that police can only enter a home without a warrant if they have an objectively reasonable basis to believe that an occupant is seriously injured or is in imminent danger of harming themselves or others. Mr. Case maintains that no such emergency existed. He points to the fact that the officers waited nearly 40 minutes outside his home before making entry. If there had truly been an urgent or life-threatening situation, they would have acted immediately. The delay, he argues, proves that there were no exigent circumstances justifying their warrantless entry. Furthermore, he asserts that the search was not lawful under the community caretaking doctrine, a legal principle the Supreme Court specifically limited in Caniglia versus Strom. In that case, the court made it clear that the community caretaking exception does not extend to the home, and that police cannot use that justification to bypass the warrant requirement. In response, the state of Montana claims that the objectively reasonable basis standard used by the Montana courts is functionally equivalent to probable cause. They argue that the disagreement is mostly about wording and that the substance of the standard remains consistent with constitutional requirements. But Mr. Case and his legal team emphasize that this is not just a debate over language. They believe that since the Caniglia versus Strom ruling, lower courts have struggled to apply a consistent standard for warrantless home entries during emergencies. They argue that the Supreme Court should hear this case in order to provide clear guidance on when police can legally enter a home without a warrant under the emergency aid exception. They point out that while Caniglia versus Strom clarified that community caretaking alone is not a valid reason to enter a home without a warrant, the court did acknowledge that police may still do so in true emergency situations, if exigent circumstances exist. However, Caniglia versus Strom did not go into detail about how to assess or define those emergency exceptions, leaving many lower courts divided on how to apply the rule. Mr. Case's legal team contends that the Montana courts defaulted to using the exigent circumstances exception without seriously considering the limitations outlined in Caniglia versus Strom. As a result, they argue the court should take this opportunity to revisit the issue and provide much-needed clarity. To better understand the significance of Caniglia versus Strom, here's what happened in that case. One evening, during a heated argument with his wife, Edward Caniglia retrieved a handgun, placed it on the dining room table, and made a dramatic statement, something along the lines of, "Why don't you just shoot me and get it over with?" Concerned by the incident, his wife left the house and stayed at a hotel overnight. The next morning, unable to reach her husband by phone, she grew increasingly worried and contacted law enforcement. She arranged to meet officers at their home. When police arrived, they found Mr. Caniglia sitting calmly on the front porch. There was no immediate danger, no signs of violence, and no indication that he was a threat at that moment. Despite this, the officers convinced Mr. Caniglia to go with them for a psychological evaluation. Before leaving, he clearly told the officers that he did not consent to them seizing his firearms. They agreed not to take them. However, once he was gone, officers spoke with his wife. They told her that Mr. Caniglia had given permission to remove the firearms, which was not true. Believing the officers, she allowed them to enter the home, and they proceeded to confiscate his weapons. This incident led to a lawsuit, and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously in favor of Mr. Caniglia. The court held that the officers violated the Fourth Amendment by entering the home and seizing property without a warrant and without valid justification under the community caretaking doctrine. That decision is now a cornerstone of Mr. Case's argument. His legal team is urging the Supreme Court to use Case versus Montana to clarify the limits of warrantless home entries under the emergency aid exception. They argue that, in the absence of clearly defined exigent circumstances, police cannot lawfully enter a person's home without a warrant, and that allowing them to do so would erode the fundamental protections guaranteed by the Fourth Amendment. This case eventually reached the United States Supreme Court in 2021. In a rare and powerful 9-0 unanimous decision, the court ruled in favor of Mr. Caniglia. The majority opinion, authored by Justice Clarence Thomas, reaffirmed that the Fourth Amendment protects individuals in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. At the very heart of this protection lies the fundamental right of a person to retreat into their home and be free from unwarranted governmental intrusion. Justice Thomas emphasized that what may be considered reasonable in the context of vehicles does not automatically apply to the sanctity of one's home. On that basis, the court concluded that the warrantless entry into Mr. Caniglia's residence and the subsequent seizure of his firearms was unconstitutional. Since that landmark decision in Caniglia versus Strom, the Supreme Court has not revisited the issue of when police may enter a home without a warrant under emergency or other exceptions. In the time since, lower courts, like those in Montana, have struggled to consistently apply the principles set forth in that ruling. That's where this new case comes into focus. Mr. Case is now asking the Supreme Court to step in once more, this time to clarify the limits and scope of the emergency aid and exigent circumstances exceptions. He argues that guidance is desperately needed, as courts across the country have taken varying and sometimes conflicting approaches since Caniglia versus Strom. This case has the potential to reshape how the law views warrantless entries, especially those based on claims of emergency aid or public safety concerns. It raises serious questions about the boundaries of Fourth Amendment protections and when those rights may be overridden by law enforcement. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear the case in its upcoming term. Briefing deadlines have already been scheduled. Mr. Case's legal team will file their opening brief by July 30th, followed by the state of Montana's response on September 3rd. Given these early deadlines, it's expected that oral arguments will be heard before the end of the year. In addition, we may see a wave of amicus briefs filed in support of both sides, particularly from Second Amendment advocacy groups and civil liberties organizations, highlighting the wide-reaching implications of the court's decision. This case touches on several major constitutional issues: your right to be free from warrantless government intrusion in your home, your right to keep and bear arms, and the role of law enforcement in so-called emergency scenarios. What happened in Caniglia versus Strom, where police allegedly misled a spouse to gain access and remove firearms, may now become a reference point in how the Supreme Court defines and restricts such actions going forward. So this is a case to watch very closely. It could shape how courts interpret Fourth Amendment protections, and whether emergency exceptions continue to be broadly applied, or whether tighter limits are finally imposed. As always, I'll keep you updated as more developments unfold. If you found this breakdown helpful and want to support the channel, the best way to do that is by subscribing. Also, feel free to like and leave a comment below to share your thoughts on this case. Thanks so much for watching.